and the VS Code IDE. Now, when it comes to Unity, we always try and record using the latest stable release of Unity. And at the start of each lecture, whenever we're in the environment, we'll list which version we're using on the title slide. So, as an example, you can see the current version that we're using for this course at the top of the slide here. As a side note, I would strongly recommend using the same version as the instructor throughout the course. This way, you'll be able to follow along exactly with what they're doing. This will help stop you getting tripped up by any potential visual changes in the editor, as well as any code changes behind the scenes. And talking of code, we're going to be using the Visual Studio Code IDE throughout this course. The reason we're using this particular environment over any other is really twofold. The first is that the interface is very similar between Mac, Windows, and Linux, so we can be relatively confident that what we're showing you on screen is roughly what you're going to be seeing on your screen. And the second option is because this is a very lightweight IDE and is very easy to use. However, if you're a more seasoned coder and you have a preferred IDE, then do go ahead and use that instead. Now, in addition to just using Visual Studio Code, we are also going to be adding some extensions to this to make it work a bit more nicely with Unity. And the two extensions we're going to be installing are C# by Microsoft and Unity Code Snippets. So with that information out of the way, I think it's time for a challenge. I'd like you to get your environment set up. Go ahead and download and install Unity, and if possible, try and use the same version as the instructor for the best learning journey. Then go ahead and install Visual Studio Code or an editor of your choice. And once that's finished installing, go ahead and add the C# and Unity Code Snippets extensions. So pause the video now and give that a go. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've now got everything installed, but if you haven't and you faced a few problems, then let me walk you through some of the process. First of all, let's go ahead and download Unity. So here I am on their website at unity.com/download. And at the time of recording, this is what the page looks like, but this may change in the future. However, somewhere on here, we'll have a download button. And in this case, it's at the top. So we've got a download Windows and download other versions button. And if we scroll down ever so slightly, we'll have links to download the Unity Hub for Windows, Mac, and Linux. Now, I'm on a Windows machine, so I'm going to click on Download for Windows. But if you're on a different platform, then select the one that's right for you. And the reason we're installing the Unity Hub here and not a specific Unity version directly is because the Hub allows us to manage all of our different versions in one central place. With that downloaded, let's go ahead and click on that to open it up. This will then take us through the license agreement and a very standard software install process. And once you're done, go ahead and load up the Unity Hub. And this may take a moment if it's the first time you've loaded it, but eventually you'll get to this lovely screen here. And Unity Hub, just as a word of warning, does update reasonably frequently. So if it looks slightly different, then don't panic. There will usually be down the left-hand side, at the bare minimum, you'll have a projects tab to load up all of your pre-existing Unity projects. And we'll have an installs tab where you can go to install new versions of the Unity editor. So while we're in this installs tab, we can see a couple of tabs along this top piece. So we've got all of our install versions, we've got the official released versions, and we've got any pre-release versions that we might be playing with. If you've never used Unity before, then all of these lists will be empty. So to add a new version, up in the top right, there will always be a button for installing a new editor. Here we've got another 3 tabs. So we've got the official releases, and generally speaking, it's recommended that you go with the latest long-term support version of Unity, or LTS version. And this is just because it's the most stable version. However, for the courses, we do tend to go with the latest stable release rather than just the long-term support version. And this just helps keep the course as up-to-date as possible. So in some cases, you may need to look in the official releases for the version that we're working with, or you may need to head over to the pre-releases where you'll find the alpha and beta versions. For this example, let's head over to the official releases. And rather than the long-term support versions, which is 2020 and 2021, let's aim for 2022 in my particular case. However, as I mentioned before, do try and download the same version of Unity as the course instructor. But once you've found the version you're looking for, it's just a simple case of hitting the install button. This will then bring up another new window with all of the different modules that you can add to Unity. So by default, you'll usually find that the Visual Studio Community is getting installed. This is another IDE, which is a bit more complex than Visual Studio Code and not one we tend to use in our courses. Then underneath that, we have various different options for the different platform support. WebGL build support is a very good one to install so that you can build your game for web. So once you've gone through this and picked the things that you want or need, just hit install and then this will start installing for you. But once that's done, what we can then do is head over to the Projects tab and set up a new project. This is as simple as clicking on this New Project button at the top. Here we'll find a bunch of different templates, and again, depending on the course that you're currently in, the instructor will tell you which templates to start off with. If we scroll down on the right, we have a place to add our project name and a save location, and then we just need to hit Create Project. This will then create our project and open it for us. With Unity set up now, it's time to install Visual Studio Code. And we can find a link to their download by going to code.visualstudio.com/download. And we'll also have links to these different download pages in the resources attached to this lecture, so do feel free to check that out rather than searching for yourself. And on this page, we again are presented with a download option for Windows, Linux, and Mac. So again, I'm going to pick the Windows option. That will then start our download process. And once that's finished downloading, we can go through the install process. I'm not going to worry about doing that on camera though. I'm sure you've got this install process down by now. But once we're done, we need to once again head back over into Unity. And if we go up to the Edit menu and then down to our Preferences, if we open this up and head over to the External Tools on the left menu bar here, the very first option in here is our external script editor. Now, I've already got this set up as Visual Studio Code, but if you have another IDE already installed or if you're using a different coding environment, then you can select that from the list. I'm going to stick with Visual Studio Code for now though. We can then close down our Preferences window, and to test that this is all working, I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to right-click in our bottom project window here. We're going to go up to Create, and then up to C# Script. I'm going to leave it as a new mono behavior for now, and just double-click that to open it up. This presents us with the script that we clicked on, but what we're really interested in is inside Visual Studio Code, we want to add our two extensions. Over on the very far left, we'll have a couple of options, and the very bottom one is our extensions. Here we can already see I've got a few different extensions installed, but if you don't have any, then just in the search box, the first one we want to look for is C# by Microsoft. So that's this top one here. And if we click on it in the sidebar, then we'll get their main page. At the very top, we'll have a couple of options, and I've got an uninstall button, meaning it's already installed. But if you don't, then this will be an install button. So go ahead and click on that and run through that process. With that set up, we then need to find our Unity code snippets, so let's search for that. And again, it's this top one by Kleber Silver that we want. So again, click on that in the panel, and then on the main page, we want to look for the install button. And the reason we're adding these two extensions is to make the coding experience a lot nicer. So if we head back to the new mono behavior script as an example, those two extensions will allow us to use IntelliSense. So as we start typing something, for instance, the instantiate method, it will pop up in our list and try and guess what we're trying to type. And it'll also give us this handy tooltip to show us the different overloaded versions of our methods. So congratulations on getting Unity and Visual Code all set up. and you're now in a good place to jump into the rest of the course. Sure, let's get a new Unity project up and running and import the Unity package that we'll be using as a starting template to get you started off in the right direction. The first thing I'd like to do is come up here and I'm just going to create a new Unity project. Now I'm going to be using Unity version 2023.1.0 B20. It's in beta version currently at the moment. If in the future you're watching this and this version is either no longer in beta or you can use a newer version of 2023, you could probably go ahead and do so. I'd recommend, however, you use this exact same version just so everything is set up in the exact same way as me so you can follow along completely. I'm going to go ahead and select my version, come down here and select 2D URP since we'll be using the URP settings for things like light and post-processing. And I'm just going to go ahead and call my project name the Game Fill Course. Let's go ahead and create that project. With that new Unity project open, the first thing I'd like to do is I'm going to come over here to my layout window and I'm going to select my layout. Now you won't have this option available as my layout is something I've created and saved, but I'd love to show you how I have it set up. I've got my hierarchy down below in the bottom left with my project and console right next to it and my tile maps, animator, and animation windows that we'll be using later on in the bottom right. I've got the scene view and the game window typically open at the same time so I can see them side by side. But I am going to come over here to this game tab. I'm going to find this 16:9 aspect ratio and I'm just going to change it to 1920 by 1080. With that, I've got my Unity layout set up in a way that looks good to me. I'm going to come down here in my assets directory and I'm just going to drag these URP settings and I'm just going to drag them into my settings folder. Next up, let's import the Unity package that we'll be using. Now, depending on what platform you're viewing this on, look for some sort of resources tab or a downloadable tab somewhere in your browser and you should find a Unity Game Fill pre-course package. Once you have that downloaded, go ahead and extract it and you'll find this Unity package file. Once you have that open, you can just go ahead and directly drag that into your assets directory. So I'll go ahead and do that and we'll get a nice pop-up here. We're just going to go ahead, keep everything selected and I'll just select import. And that's going to give us everything that we need throughout this entire course, including all of the scripts that we'll be starting with and all of the sprites that we'll be using later on. But let's clean just a couple things up. In my scenes folder, I'm going to open that up and head into my playground scene with a double click. I'm just going to delete my sample scene. We don't need that. With my playground scene open, you can see a couple things are a little bit wonky. Now the Unity package file that we just imported into our project, things can get a little bit weird sometimes. We've got everything we need, but we do need to actually reassign some of the layers as well as some of the Unity settings. So let's go ahead and do that first. I'm just going to click any old game object in my hierarchy so I can pull up this layer menu. So over here, you can actually see that it really wants to name my player something, but it doesn't have it yet. Let's go ahead and click that, and I'm just going to click Add Layer to open up my Layers menu. Inside of my layers, I'm going to create a friendly layer as well as a ground layer. Now I'm going to leave this open for just a second because the spelling is important. We'll be using this later on. Now the Unity package can sometimes be a bit finicky for me. Sometimes when I nail the exact same spelling right away, it will actually immediately assign what it was trying to assign before. Let's see if that worked. So if I click my player, yeah, see, this time it didn't actually work. I'm going to come into my layer settings up here in this drop down and I'm going to select the friendly layer for my player and all of its children. So yes, I'm going to change the children of anything in my player game object. The other thing that we want to make sure that is also set to friendly is in the prefabs folder and our bullet. Let's actually make sure that this is also set to the friendly layer as well. What we'd like to do is just make sure our bullet that's going to be instantiated and flying from the player's gun is not colliding with the player itself. Now, what are we going to set to the ground layer? Well, that's this Unity tile map that I'm using. So in my grid game object, I'm going to select the foreground layer. And I'm going to change that to, see, that's actually, I think, what we did. In the original project, I probably had something like friendly on layer 6 and ground was on layer 3 or something like that. But simple enough, all we want to do is make sure that the foreground game object in our hierarchy that has our tile map on it is set to the ground layer, which will make sure that we can properly interact with jumping off the tile map and things like that. Next, let's go into our project settings. So edit project settings. And I'm going to look for my physics 2D dropdown. Here on my layer collision matrix, I'm going to find my friendly by friendly collision, and I'm just going to disable that to make sure that bullet isn't colliding with my player colliders. Great. Next up, let's make sure our sorting layers are also set up correctly. So you could click a game object like I did before, or just come into this Layers tab and click Edit Layers and go into our Sorting Layers panel. I'm going to go ahead and create just one new layer that I'm going to call Backdrop. So I'm going to come on over here, and in our screen space canvas, I'm going to select all these 1, 2, 3, 4 backdrop images, head into my sorting layer, and just make sure that is properly set to backdrop. Head back over to my layers panel to make sure that it's being layered correctly, and I'm just going to drag backdrop above default. And everything should be good there. Now you might have noticed, why is a screen space canvas using a sprite renderer component instead of an image? Well, we'll get into that later, but just a little bit of a teaser. It's so our lights can properly display on this sprite renderer game object. Next up, let's go ahead and into the package manager install a couple packages that we'll need. The first thing that we can do is head on over to Packages in Project and change that to the Unity registry and search for Cinemachine to get all of our cameras working as intended. We'll go ahead and hit install there, and we'll let that go ahead and do its thing. Very nice. With Cinemachine installed, I'm going to make sure my Cinemachine camera confiner is set up correctly as well as properly following the player. With my virtual camera selected, it looks like mine auto-populated, which is great. If yours doesn't, just make sure this follow property is properly following the player transform, which is just this player game object in the hierarchy. It looks like my Cinemachine camera confiner 2D got rigged up correctly. If yours isn't, just make sure that this bounding shape 2D property has this camera confiner game object thrown into it. Let's also come into the camera confiner game object and also assign that layer to friendly as well. Okay, I'm going to blow up my game view and see if everything is working as intended. Alrighty, we can move around with the WAS and D keys at lightning speed. We can jump with the spacebar, but only if we're jumping off of the tile map with that ground layer directly. We can left click with our bullet, and we'll just shoot directly left or directly right, depending on which direction we're facing. Slimes have a health component that when they take 3 damage or 3 bullets, they'll get destroyed. Our player doesn't have health or anything like that. But what's most important is everything is working as intended for me so far, so that gives us a nice clean slate to work with moving forward. Now your ground detection might be a little bit buggy. You can notice you can jump directly off the walls. There's a little bit of a weird collision with the way that the player jumps off of the sides and things like that. I will admit it's a little bit fun, albeit it's a bit buggy, but it's by design, and we'll make sure we go ahead and address some of those issues soon. Great, and with that, I think we're set to move on. In the next lecture, I'm going to do a bit of an overview on how the project is set up so far, going a little bit over the hierarchy, going over what's in each individual folder, and then most importantly, giving you a brief overview on each individual script, just to give you a basic understanding of how the project is set up. When you're ready to dive into that meaty material, I'll see you on the next one. Lecture, let's dive into some of the things that came along with the Unity package and give you a nice overview of the project so far. Let's dive in. So, going from top left to bottom right in our assets directory, there's not much in the animations folder. It just holds the current enemy animator and the animation for moving. Most importantly, in the imported assets folder, all that you really need to take note of mentally is the Bar Street Craft Pix holds this README file, and all it really says is this Bar Street Craft Pix comes with this tile set that we're using and these nice background images to give our scene a little bit of life. But all of the assets found in this specific folder are for educational purposes only. That is to say, you can't use them for any sort of commercial purpose or redistribute them in any way. Now, that being said, skipping down to the sprites folder briefly, anything found in this sprites folder are all just assets created by yours truly. So you're welcome to use any of the sprites found in this specific folder in any way that deems fit to you. The materials folder just has a single no friction material, and the prefabs folder has a few different prefabs that we've set up in this project so far. The scenes folder we've already taken a look at there. It's just got that one and only playground scene. The scripts folder we'll come back to shortly. The settings folder doesn't have much other than our basic URP settings. Now you can take note of this base preset file. I don't think we'll actually need to use it much, but just a little bit of a gem on how I have this set up. This base preset file is going to allow us so that if you were to import any other sort of sprite to this project, they're just going to automatically import with these settings here, so you don't have to change it to a PPU of 16 every time. You don't have to make sure the filter mode is set to anything. All you have to do to properly rig that up is go into Edit, Project Settings, come on down to our Preset Manager here on the left, and add a default preset. You just have to search for Texture Importer. Once you select that, you can just assign your preset that we just chatted about here into this property on the left. If or when we decide to import any other sprite files into this project, it'll just automatically come with these settings. Next up is our tile map. The way that I have it set up is this single rule tile in our tile map. So that way, if you click this single rule tile, you can draw in any sort of way that looks good to you, and you should actually have that rule tile working nicely. I'll undo those changes I just made. Now, if you're not familiar with a rule tile or tile maps, it's a bit out of the scope of this course and what we're trying to accomplish. So I just wanted to let you know that we won't be spending a bunch of time on this topic. Now, I breezed over that pretty quickly, so this lecture's challenge is just going to be to familiarize yourself with the project so far and make sure your layout is set up in a way that feels good to you. Take about 5-10 minutes or so and just make sure you understand which class is attached to which game object. Now, don't spend too much time going over the classes yourself right after this challenge. We'll go through those scripts together and I'll give you a nice quick overview of how the scripts are set up so far. Take a moment to do that, pause the video, and I'll see you back here in a few moments. Alright, welcome back. So into the scripts folder, I'm just going to go ahead and open any old script. Now I believe this is the first time that I'm opening VS Code within this project, so I'm just going to do a quick IntelliSense check. Yep, looks like we're good there. I'm going to open back up my File Explorer, and I'm just going to go from top to bottom. I'd like to take a moment and just briefly talk about some of my naming conventions that I've grown quite accustomed to over time. You can see that I'm actually using these underscores at the top of my private class variables. However, whenever I pass through a parameter or I have a local variable that I'm using inside of a method, for example, if I was to do something like example float, I'm just going to use normal uncapitalized camel case. However, whenever I have a promoted private variable at the top of a class, I'm going to differentiate that with this little underscore. Now, if for whatever reason we need to set some sort of public property or variable up top, and we have a public float of some kind, then I'm actually going to use uppercase Pascal case just to differentiate those three. Now, there's a lot of different naming conventions or coding practices or what some people might refer to as a style guide out there floating around in both Unity and the programming world, but I'd just like to let you know that this is what I'm going to use to notate my different variables. You're welcome to use whatever sort of naming convention feels good to you. Most important thing to keep in mind when you're coming up with a good naming convention is just to keep things consistent. In the health class, there isn't much to mention here. That's just taking a starting health as a serialized field that we can attach just to our enemy prefab at the moment, and every single time our bullet collides with it, it just takes damage until it's destroyed. Great, not much to talk about there. In our bullet class, we've got a couple different serialized fields as you can imagine, but all that really is important to take note is we're firing it directly to the left or directly to the right, depending on which direction our player is facing, according to the mouse on the screen. We're moving the bullet in fixed update according to its rigid body, and if it collides with a game object that has the health component attached to it, it does that 1 damage. In the gun class, we're currently using the old Unity input system, and every single time we just fire the left mouse button, we're shooting the projectile. Later on in the course, we're going to re-rig everything to use the new Unity input system, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. We've got a relatively straightforward player controller class. I've got a very simple singleton set up in a way just so we can access the player controller easily, because we know there'll only ever be one player controller in our scene. And in update, we're doing a couple different things. We're first and foremost gathering the input using the old Unity input system. Again, we'll change that a little bit later on. And we're setting this movement vector 2 up top, so that way when we get into fixed update, we can move our rigid body appropriately. And all we're doing in jump is just checking on if the player presses the spacebar key and is grounded, then go ahead and jump with your rigid body. Well, how do we tell if something is grounded? We're setting this up currently in a way that I think is far from ideal, but it's something that's relatively common for beginners. They're just checking on if the player collides with that tile map with the ground layer. Now we're using these icky, disgusting string references. On collision exit and on collision enter is going to lead to some unintended bugs along the way. So we're going to fix that a little bit later on. We've got this public bool that we can use in our gun to see if our player is facing left and right. That's also going to be decided in that handle sprite flip method placed inside of update, which is just detecting which side of the screen our mouse is on and then flipping the entire player game object accordingly. Awesome. I think that's enough jibber jabbering for me, and I think we're ready to hop in and actually start typing some of our own code and refactoring a few things in a nice, beautiful way to make this game go from a that was okay to a A+ game fill sort of game. I think the only thing I'd like to do before we jump in is head on over into my player game object, into my player controller component, and I'm just going to change my move speed to something a bit more reasonable. I think something like that seems a bit more reasonable, so I'll just leave it at 12 for now. When you're ready to dive into the first real meaty lecture, I'll see you on the next one.